Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of week 4. Hopefully you were able to take a little bit of a break after the first half of today's lecture, and we're going to return to talking about imaging of the social world, images of conflict. So military, commercial, and propagandistic uses of photography were definitely exploited during war and colonial expansion. A lot of times you'll see the camera and the gun kind of being allied or aligned, in the sense that you point and shoot a gun, you point and shoot a camera. But it really wasn't clear from the start how to circulate, sell, and archive images of conflict, right? So the questions that came up were, would audiences want to see combat photographs made sometimes weeks or months before they reached an exhibition hall? We know that that happens because there's, not the type of mail service we have today, right? Everything was a lot slower, so it could be a huge time gap between the actual event and when anyone got to see it. The other questions: should a photographer censor the violence of the battlefield? Would consumers buy images of war after it was resolved? And all of these questions, among others, could not be answered beforehand because there were no precedents to follow. It had never been done before. War had not been photographed before. So there is a lot of information in this section about war and photography. And I want to start with this stereograph here of a soldier killed in the Civil War. Before the Civil War, Oliver Wendell Holmes predicted that the next European war would send stereographs of the battles, and this did in fact happen as the Civil War broke out. And we're not going to jump right into the Civil War, we'll get to that in a minute. We're going to talk about a couple other things first. But you can see in this stereograph here, you've got titles on either side: photographic history, the war for the Union, and then there's a little blue message on the top. This was likely put there just so that we could see it on one card. Usually this information is on the reverse side, but it does say soldier killed in the trenches in the storming of Petersburg, Virginia, April. The marks and spots on his face are blood issuing from his mouth and nose. The wound is in the head caused by a fragment of a shell. So you can see that this is a pretty violent looking stereograph. It's depicting death and blood and the carnage of war. And this is something that you could put in your stereo viewer and see in 3D. Now, prior to photography, we know that there were only paintings and engravings that circulated as visual information about what would happen in a war. And most of these paintings and engravings were depicted rather heroically. They didn't necessarily show the carnage and the death in the same way that a photograph does. The photograph represents it truthfully, and it is very much reality. It's a mirror on the real world. There's no sort of artistic liaison that you kind of get when you have a painting or an engraving. So because of this, because everyone is so used to seeing the painted version, the engraved version, and not necessarily the photographic representation of war, no one really thought to talk about the possibility of how war photographs would be different. The other thing that everyone kind of forgot about was the technical inadequacy of photography and how that might be an issue. You can see this cart here, and you've seen it in a couple of videos previously as well. This is like their photographic van, essentially. It says photographic van on the side. It's a little cart that would have been pulled by some horses or some oxen. And inside there is all the equipment that you would need to bring with you to the battlefield. So depending on which type of printing you are using, and if you recall, there's several, right? We have the daguerreotype, which was using the plates. We have the calotype using paper. And then there's versions on the calotype where you're using the collodion wet plate process, you're using perhaps the albumen process or the wax paper process. All of these are different, but the first few, the original daguerreotype, the original calotype, the collodion wet plate process, those had a lot more labor involved with them. They were a little more accessible at the time, but they had a lot of labor involved. So you would have to have all of that equipment there and ready and in your photographic van. And if you were using the wax paper process or the albumin process, those had papers prepared ahead of time, so you would have a little bit more flexibility, but you still had to have all of this equipment because you were prepping paper and plates, you had to set up your darkroom, your studio, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that had to go with you when you were going to war as a photographer. And so some of the other technical inadequacies that I'm referring to here come with the difficulty of capturing the rapid action that you can encounter in a battlefield, right? Exposure times were still pretty long compared to how we know them today, and so that would make it almost impossible to capture an actual battle scene photographically. You're also going to come into low lighting or difficult lighting situations. Strong winds could completely stop a photographer from creating any image at all. So everyone did seem to forget about how cumbersome the photographic equipment was, and because of this, there were a lot of sketch artists that would still continue to produce the majority of imagery that the public saw. So the sketch artists would be sent out to sort of draw what they saw happening, and it would be brought back to be turned into either an engraving or a painting at that time. The photographers would record what they could, right? So it might be a landscape of war, a fort or an encampment, something like this here. They would take photographs of the troops, something that they would set up and pose them for. They would take pictures of the officers, before and after battle scenes, that kind of stuff. That was what was accessible at that time before those exposure times got to a place where they could actually capture battle scenes. So we're going to start talking about the Crimean War. This is going to give us kind of a foundation of some different things that were happening with early war photography. And Crimea is a peninsula at the northern end of the Black Sea. You can sort of make out where it is in relation to Russia and the Ukraine on this map. So the big part on here is actually Crimea, and then if you look in the little bubble to the right, there's a blue arrow pointing to where that's situated on the map as a whole, so you can kind of get an idea of where we are in the world here. So there's these newspaper reports coming out by this London journalist named William Howard Russell, and he was describing all of the terrible conditions that the soldiers were experiencing during this war. And the War Department doesn't like to hear that, so they sent photographers to Crimea to kind of take photographs to prove that this wasn't what was happening. This was in an effort to kind of disprove what the journalists were writing about. And this initial group of photographers who went out there came back with photographs that proved what the journalists were writing was actually correct and truthful. So the War Department dubs this as unsuccessful, and they put those photographs away. They don't show them to anyone. And then they get 2 new photographers to commission and send over there to make images of war. They're sending them to document the war and the conditions of the soldiers. So Roger Fenton and James Robertson, these are the 2 photographers that the War Department pays quite a good sum of money to go out and take very spec photographs. So we're going to start with some of Fenton's images. And Fenton was a pretty well-known British photographer. He had worked with Gustave Le Gray, who, if you remember, had invented that wax paper process of photography. And Fenton sent letters from the war back to Britain, which clearly showed that he was frustrated with how the war was being mismanaged, and everything that he was reporting on aligned exactly with what the newspaper reporters were writing about at the same time and what those previous photographers had taken photographs of. However, because he had been instructed to take such specific photographs, he didn't have very explicit photographs, right? So he didn't take photographs that represented what he was writing about in his letters. He didn't take photographs that proved what the journalists were writing were correct. They didn't necessarily make reference to the poor conditions the soldiers were experiencing, the craziness that was happening over there at this time. He didn't depict fallen soldiers. He didn't depict any wreckage. He also didn't show the results of the supply shortages that were causing the soldiers to then have to go and loot civilian homes to sort of stay in good health. Like the painters and the engravers of the past, he made these more heroic looking images of military leaders. Here's an official on his horse. You can kind of imagine that this could also be a subject of a painting, right? So he would take these very heroic images like this one here, soldiers in the camp in their uniforms, and of course landscapes as well. And all of these things should be documented, right? Like this should be something that we see, but when it's covering something else up, that's when it becomes problematic and contradictory. So before we go into that subject, oops, hold on. I'm not ready to do that yet. So we know that Fenton had some motivation from the government that had suggested that the images and visual evidence should show that the newspapers were exaggerating the disease and starvation that was being endured by the troops. And Fenton also knew that his images were going to be considered for publishing and that there would be a public exhibition. So he assumed that people would not want to see or buy images of suffering and carnage. So what does that mean? He's making a decision to only show non-controversial imagery. And he's doing it not only because he got paid by the government, but also because he thinks he can make more money if he leaves out all of the terrible things that he's witnessing while he's over there. So, due to Fenton's censoring, the public and the press didn't have any issues with the content of his images. He actually got really high praise by the critics for how factual and superior his images were. So you can say that these images are factual because they are representing what they're showing, right? They're showing troops, they're showing high-ranking officials, they're showing camps, forts, and all of those things. But they aren't showing the truth of what's actually happening. He's leaving out crucial parts in favor of money. Now we're ready for this next one. So this might be one of Fenton's most famous images. It's titled The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and hopefully you read about this in your textbook. And you can see that there are cannonballs kind of strewn all over the place in this image. However, the key thing here is that Fenton did not arrive at this place until months after the battle here had taken place. And this is actually the second of two images in this place. The first one, which I don't have, there's hardly any cannonballs in this vista here. And in this one, which is the second image, you can see a whole bunch of them. So what this means is that Fenton and his crew probably showed up and moved all the cannonballs into this scene to construct an image that suggested that a battle had just taken place. So that seems slightly problematic. We're arranging a scene here and making it seem like the truth. This is a prime example of how the photographer has agency to manipulate a scene as well as the information being presented to the audience. So what we need to think about is, how do we think about truth in photographs when it comes to a situation like this? And I like to parallel this with the photograph that we talked about last week of the first surgery in which they use ether, right? So that photograph was not taken during the actual surgery. We find out later that it was reenacted afterwards as a sort of symbolic representation of this very important historic moment. And I think that's okay, because you're not going to be able to get the shot you want in the middle of a surgery, right? The war situation, on the other hand, presents some other issues. So Fenton and his crew are making it seem as though something happened here when maybe something didn't happen here. And I think that if he was presenting an entire catalog of all of the things that he was witnessing, so yes, the landscapes, yes, the troops and the soldiers, but also the little bit more hard to stomach things, the poor conditions of the soldiers, disease, starvation, suffering, carnage, all of that. If he was presenting it all as a whole, then I wouldn't take so much issue with this image being staged. But because he's choosing to leave so much out, then we're presented with this problem, right, of censorship and deciding what people should see and what they shouldn't see, and also that this was staged, it was set up. So, I mean, he's really not hurting anyone by moving some cannonballs into a scene here, but we have to think about what people are reading when they see these images. They're seeing that as the truth. So if the photographer is kind of using their truth tool, the camera, and using it to lie and be slightly deceitful, then what does that mean about the truthfulness of photography? So obviously, you all might have different opinions on this particular image and how it was set up, and the ether surgery image and how that one was set up, and that's totally fine. This is a subject that can have a lot of different viewpoints, and there's really not one correct perspective on it, but it's just something to keep in mind, something to consider, and remember that when you're withholding information or changing information, then what does that do to the story and the history of everything? So I'll let you kind of decide how you want to interpret that. But that's always kind of a good topic for a photojournal too, if that's something that you're interested in. Not that you have to do that, but just a nice way to kind of work that out in words if you care to. All right. So next is James Robertson. He's the second more famous photographer of the Crimean War. He photographed using his own style, but his subjects were obviously going to be very similar to those that Fenton was shooting as well. And both he and Fenton are the best known photographers of the Crimean War, mostly because their works were published in newspapers and as prints, and they were exhibited. So this means that their works were put into circulation, and because of that, the sort of historic longevity is greater, and we recognize their images more because of how sort of ubiquitous the dissemination of this information was. We don't see or necessarily have a ton of access to those other photographers who actually took photographs of what was happening during the war. So, as mentioned when we were just talking about Fenton, there's a similar censorship definitely provoked by those who were paying Fenton and Robertson's commissions, aka the War Department, the government, as well as this stigma that the public wants to see picturesque images and not grotesque images. But what does this mean when it comes to the responsibility of the photographer? Should they be censoring what is happening, or should they be portraying the truth? And again, there's many different perspectives on this. I think that there's situations in which one might say, oh, well, you know, it's okay to show the violent things, but maybe children shouldn't see that. And that's something that always comes up when we're having this conversation about censorship. And you know, it's it's true, yeah, maybe children shouldn't be exposed to some super violent, gory images, but I think that type of censorship is the responsibility of the adult in charge of that child, and not necessarily the responsibility of the photographer, right? The photographer needs to go out and show the truth, because if they're not going to do it, who is? And if they're not going to do it, then do we get the truth? Or are we just kind of kept in the dark with everything, looking at these beautiful landscapes and saying, okay, yeah, everything's fine over there, I don't need to worry about that. So it becomes a greater like political and social issue when you really get down to it. And so I would, if you haven't thought about this before, I would take some time to kind of mull it over and think about what that means to you and what your opinion and perspective on that situation is. So I just sort of flipped through some of Robertson's photographs as I was talking here, but now I do want to dive into the American Civil War. And most folks should have some background on the Civil War, because it is supposed to be taught in, I think, junior high and high school history classes, but I know that not everyone gets the same exposure. So the Civil War began in 1861. It lasted until 1865, and it was between the North and South of the United States. So throughout that war, there are many, many images provided by war correspondents, artists, and photographers. So we're getting paintings, drawings, engravings, sketches, and photographs as well. And some of the very first pictures of the war were taken by George S. Cook, and he's here in the center of this this photograph. He was settled in the South, and as the conflict kind of escalated, he would center his photography on specifically the Confederate subjects. So here we have this photograph that he made of Major Robert Anderson, and he was in command of the Federal troops at Fort Sumter. And you can see here that it is a wet plate collodion. So that means that George S. Cook was using that collodion process in which he had to make the plate, put it in the camera immediately, take the photo, and then immediately process it. So you can see that even with the albumin and wax paper processes being available, they weren't necessarily accessible to everyone. So a lot of these war photographers were still using those slightly more antiquated methods that took a little bit more time and labor. This is just an example of one of the very popular images. This one of Major Anderson would have been turned into a carte de visite, and folks would collect military leaders alongside the other cartes that we just talked about earlier. So this one was sold by the thousands, very popular collector's item. And here's another photograph that Cook would have taken. We have some Confederate soldiers in South Carolina, and you can see that everyone in this photograph is standing pretty sturdy and still, because the exposure times are still not as we know them today and still a little bit long. But there is that gentleman in front of the cannon there, and he's holding his arm out, and you can see how it's kind of blurry because he did not pick a pose that would have been captured more crisply. He would have wiggled a little bit during that exposure. And then here we have some interior views of the Fort Sumter that Cook took after it was sort of taken over and destroyed by the Southern forces. So next I have some videos to share to kind of get an idea of how things were happening around this time. So the first thing I want to do is show you a video about the excuse me, the Civil War cameras. So let me get to that here, and we can take a peek at what's happening. There, yep, it's working. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these Civil War cameras here.
The Civil War coincide with a technology change in photography. Pre-Civil War, most images would have been daguerreotyped. The photographers used what was called the wet plate process. And it's called that due to the fact that the plates had to be exposed and processed while still wet. The interesting thing is the photographers actually would have had to follow the encampments. They would have made the portraits right at the sites. So what we have here are two studio cameras from the Civil War era. There's a Lewis wet plate camera, which would be probably the most common workhorse type camera from that era. The Civil War portraits that you see, for the most part, would have been made with a camera like this. The interesting thing about the camera is it has a repeating back, so you can actually make multiple images on one plate. It lowers the cost of portraiture as it makes it more affordable for the various soldiers to have their portraits done so they can send them back home to their families. On the back of the cameras are some gray stains, which is caused by silver nitrate, so this also helps identify them as wet plate cameras. All wet plate cameras will have dark stains on them if they were used. The stereo camera has affiliations with Matthew Brady's studio. Brady took it upon himself to document the whole Civil War. Basically paid for it out of his pocket. This is one of the cameras that belonged to the studio. The ground glass is hinged, so you actually would lower the ground glass, you can see the septum, and then the plate would go down right in here. With a stereo camera, you need to have something, it's called a septum, that actually separates the two images. Otherwise, they would overlap, so this gives you two distinct images. The stereo camera also would have been used either in a studio or in the field, used to take images after the battles have been fought. Due to the nature of the wet plate process, it's fairly slow, not that light sensitive, it was not possible to photograph motion as we think of today. So all these images would have been taken either as posed studio portraits or still life scenes after the battles had already been fought.
So that just gives you a nice idea of the cameras they were using and a visual on how that's going. And then the next one I have you all ever seen the war reenactors, like Civil War reenactors or any war reenactors? For those of you who don't know, there are these groups and coalitions of people who get together and they dress up in traditional Civil War garb and they reenact the battle scenes, and they're obsessed with it, and every single aspect of it is true to its moment in historical time. And so I actually found this great little video of these Civil War reenactors, and one of them is actually the photographer, and so he uses the complete method, traditional method that they would have used then, and it's sort of all outlined here. It's a demonstration. So we're going to watch that, and you can see kind of how the process works from making the plate, putting it into the camera, to getting a final image.
The process used for photography during the Civil War was called wet plate collodion. It involved using something called a mixture called collodion, which was nitrocellulose with ether and had iodides and bromides added to it. This was actually poured onto the glass plate, and while the plate was still tacky with this collodion mixture, it was then immersed into a bath of silver nitrate. From there, that plate came out of the silver bath under darkroom light, was loaded into a plate holder, and then was loaded into the camera from there. From this time, you had about 3 to 5 minutes in which to work until that plate actually dried out on you and became useless. Thus the name was wet plate process. It also meant that you had to have some sort of a darkroom with you, be it a darkroom wagon or a portable darkroom box. So what we'll be doing today is actually demonstrating how to make an ambrotype, which is a positive image on glass, which you see right here. Now held up against a black background, you can see the photograph, or when something white is inserted behind it, the image actually is viewed as a negative. Okay, the first step of the process is to coat the plate with collodion. And Speedy, you got the glass plate? Thank you. A glass plate that's been prepared, meticulously clean and dusted. From here, our mixture of collodion is flowed onto the plate. It's one of the most difficult steps in the process to get good at this. Without, number one, pouring the collodion all over yourself and wasting a lot of it. And second, you need to coat it evenly so that you didn't create any waves that would end up in the finished image. You can imagine the difficulties doing this out in the field. Any dust that was in the air would, of course, land up on the plate and be in the finished image forever. Here it was just blotted until finally the ether had evaporated enough that it set up a sticky substance on the front of the plate. The plate was then immersed to a bath of silver nitrate, which was in the darkroom. Here we have a portable darkroom box that we'll be using today. It has to sit in there at least 3 to 5 minutes. What will happen next is, under darkroom light, that plate will come out of the silver bath and set into a plate holder, especially designed to hold that glass plate in a light-proof box. That plate holder will then go on the back of the camera, and the dark slide will be removed from the plate holder. Thus, the glass plate with its sensitized collodion will be looking at the back of the lens cap. Now, there were no shutters on the cameras then. You simply removed the lens cap, counted for the given amount of time for the exposure, and put the lens cap back on. Now, what the headrest is actually a, Brian, go over just a bit. There you go, good. Actually an immobilizer that will give Mr. Hodge a reference point so that his head doesn't move at all during exposure. The lens was actually owned by a Confederate photographer from Baltimore named Richard Balsall. And Mr. Balsall was famous for taking a photograph of Jefferson Davis, came back to Baltimore, was selling those images, and was arrested on charges of treason. So it's very possible that the lens we're using today is that same lens. Okay, now we have our sensitized plate. As you can see, the plate holder snaps on the back of the camera. And now that glass plate is in the exact same position that the focusing glass was when we first focused our image. Cover up that. Yeah, there you go, Rob. Can you pull the dark slide when I tell you when? Okay, go ahead. Shade that right here if you can. Okay, perfectly still. And counting. 1,004, 1,005, 1,006, 1,007, 1,009, 1,010, 1,012, 1,014, 1,016. You may move, sir. 18 seconds. First slide now goes back in, and back to the darkroom to develop. Okay. That one got 18 seconds worth. Okay, which one is it down below? No, above. Okay. It's on 10 now. It's a 10 type. From here it would have to be dried, varnished, and then dried again. And then this was something that the soldier could mail home to his folks or his loved one, or display on his wall proudly. There you go.
Okay, so the volume on that one was definitely pretty low. So if you want to see that again, which I think you should, I would use the link in the Blackboard course materials in the watch section, just so that you can get the volume on that. So sorry, it's always so hard to tell what the volume's going to do in these situations. So that I really like that video because it kind of gives you the sort of start to finish, and it's the quick start to finish version of what they would have had to do for each individual photograph. when they're working with a wet plate collodion process. So during this time of war, you've got a lot of photographers that see the conflict as an opportunity to expand their markets. So again, we're looking at how can we make more money on photography, exploit the war. So images of politicians and military leaders were really popular. Families of soldiers going to war wanted pictures of their young men, who in turn wanted pictures of their families. So photographers like the three Bergstresser brothers, they would set up these makeshift studios at military camps to provide these photographic services to the soldiers, and this is their makeshift studio here. You can kind of see that they've set it up so that they have a big skylight there where they can control the light coming in and out for doing the portraits inside. And that would sort of shield them from any dust and dirt that might get into the wet plate processes that they're using. And so these brothers followed the army around for over a year, making thousands of images, sometimes 160 in one day. And if you think about that process that we just watched, could you imagine making 160 of those images in one day? It's just, it's insane to think of the output that they were getting from that. So the recently invented tintype photographs, which were made on thin sheets of iron, I don't know why they call them tintypes, but they're made on iron. They're popular, they're cheap, they're lightweight, makes them compact and portable for the soldiers. So that's what most of these photographs are being printed on, is these iron plates for the tintypes. So I do have a video where this guy talks about the tintypes that we'll watch in a second, but before we do that, I have two more tintypes here. So you can see the one on the left has some hand coloring done on the sort of metallic accents of the uniform, and then the flag in the background has also been hand colored. So that's something that was not just being done on the daguerreotypes that we talked about last week, but also on the tintypes and calotypes, etc. And then the one on the right, it looks it's a black and white picture of a black and white photograph, so it looks a little funny, but you can see that in both of these pictures, the soldier's holding their gun against their chest and like firmly holding either the rifle or their leg so that they stay still for the extended exposure time that they're dealing with there. So let's go grab this tintype video so we can see how that works. And we'll just truck along here. All right, here we go.
I think tintype itself, the word was probably just kind of like street talks, something that was cheap back then would have been made out of tin, tinware. Plus it just rolls off the tongue so nicely, the tintype. We sort of have to go back to the beginning with its invention in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer, an Englishman. Images on tin were done, really interested in those. So we can almost sort of say in a weird kind of way that it was invented in the United States in the middle 1850s. And at the beginning it was called either a ferrotype, or it was also called a melanotype, which are both names that don't really roll off the tongue very easily. And I'm not really sure of its origin, but somehow the term tintype came into being, even though there's no tin at all in a so-called tintype. And I've always loved 19th century photography, and I've always studied it. There's just something peculiar. Maybe it's just because these images have aged for 150 years or more, but they're almost like transmissions from the past. When I was a little kid, I was a Civil War nut. Me and my friend down the street always used to dress up. We had our own little uniforms, and we were always Confederates for some strange reason. I'm not sure why, but could have been because I had a gray navy blanket that worked out quite nicely for a Confederate uniform. But so I was always like poring over books as a little kid, and always fascinated with the photographic images of the Civil War. And it occurred to me, one of the first forms of photography I ever really consciously thought about which was the Civil War era photography, was wet plate collodion. Here I am doing it now. Who would have guessed? Grandmother had photo albums, old family photo albums, and that was one of my favorite activities as a kid. Always looking through, our own family snapshots. In the case of my grandmother, she had all the old stuff, right? And in that box, there was just one tintype. It was the only one in there. And that image always kind of mesmerized me. I just found it very interesting and fascinating because apart from like paper prints, this thing had weight and gravity to it. It was its own little object. And I think that really sort of captivated me. The thing that's very interesting about wet plate collodion that I found is that as a major shift from shooting film is when I see a subject, I have to stop and think to myself, do I really want to stop and set up all this stuff and take this picture? Sometimes the answer is no, and I just go on my way. This process really has made me kind of hone my visual instincts. One of the things that was compelling about it, well, number one, the tintype itself, because it responds to a different part of the light spectrum. So everything just right off the bat looks a little bit different, and it's kind of hard to put your finger on unless you look at an image side by side, shot with modern film and shot as a tintype, which I've done before. When you see those things, two things side by side, you realize there's something different going on. The tintype work is a little bit like cooking. It's a little bit like alchemy. I'm very, very much in control of what happens from the, manufacturing and making a tin plate to mixing up all the chemistries. And I very much like, at the end of this one-of-a-kind, in most cases, there's only one of these. I like that idea. And even shooting a modern subject, it almost looks like it's from another time period that you can't quite pin down. So you're looking at something that's of today, but not necessarily of today.
All right, so you can see that he is working with the tintype today still. So there are a lot of artists that still work with the antiquated processes from the past and use them either as a hobby like this guy does or in actual executable artwork. So I'm getting back to our slideshow here. But there's one more video that I'm just going to put in the watch folder for you. It's this guy who he builds these Civil War cameras out of all by hand and using hand tools, and it's really cool. But I'll leave that for you to watch, just because we've had a lot of videos so far. So next, I want to talk about Matthew Brady, and Matthew Brady is best remembered for his battlefield photographs that his firm took during the Civil War. Almost every single Civil War photograph that is kept in history books is from Matthew Brady or one of his associates working for him at this time. But he also created many representations of individuals and groups of soldiers. For example, we have his famous portrait of General Ulysses S. Grant. And just a little background on Brady here. He started as a portrait photographer, mostly making portraits of celebrities and politicians, distinguished figures in the law, government, business, society, and the arts, etc. So he was a renowned portrait photographer during this time. Before the outbreak of the Civil War, Brady had made probably 10,000 photographs of celebrities, including his most famous portrait of Abraham Lincoln here. And there's a great story associated with this particular photograph because before Brady had taken this image, most people had never seen Abraham Lincoln. You have to remember, we have no TV. We really don't, photographs aren't yet being printed in newspapers or any visual communication happening. So no one had seen him. But there were all of these rumors that he was really ugly during the presidential campaign. And so what Brady did is he went went in the studio with Abraham Lincoln, and he used the skills that he has with lighting and posing to kind of counteract how tall and gangly Lincoln was. And what he did with this process is he made Lincoln look so appealing in this photograph that Lincoln later credited Brady for his success in obtaining the presidency, because his photograph was successfully able to counteract all of these pretty nasty rumors that were going on about him. So before we continue, I do have a video about Brady that I want you to watch. So this will just give us a little more background on him. So let me get back to our share screen here, and we'll get this video of Brady up, and then we'll just take it from there. All right.
Matthew Brady establishes his first studio in New York in 1844. By the 1860s, is one of the foremost portrait photographers in the United States. The public is assembling photographic albums and filling the pages not only with pictures of family and friends, but they're also filling their albums with images of the leaders of the day, and Brady is one of the primary sources for such photographs.
It's interesting because it shows him very well turned out. It's a very impressive figure of a man. In other words, it's a very impressive figure of a man who could be president, who you should vote for. And afterwards, he said that Mr. Brady and the Cooper Union made me president.
He was driven. He knew that it might not be the most business-wise thing to do, but he knew that he had to document the Civil War. When Brady came back from the Battle of Antietam, he showed the pictures of all of the dead. And people would gather around and look at them in awe. It was the first time that Americans had seen their own dead, and you half expected that someone would cry out that they recognized an uncle, a father, a brother, a son. It was just horrific. It was the first time that people had seen the real horrors and how bloody the battles were.
photography that was bigger than anybody else had had previously. And he was out front. He was out front in terms of having multiple studios. He was out front in getting sitters to come sit for him. He was out front in thinking about documenting the Civil War and all the players, cultural players and political players. And so there's just so much material. Nobody can outdo him for that era.
So that one had some funny music, and it was quite loud, so hopefully that one didn't blow you out of your seats there. But that kind of gives the best overview of Brady's career. And there's this note in there that says he dies underappreciated, which he certainly did. He is really has the most photographs of the Civil War, and like I said earlier, almost every single photograph you see was made by him or someone on his team. And he didn't censor anything. You could see from the slideshow in that video, you have everything: the dead, the gruesome. You have images like the one here where the soldiers are hanging out in their camps. So he really ran the gamut, and he didn't apply any of those rules of censoring that we saw and discussed when we were looking at the Crimean War earlier. And part of that has to do with he wasn't commissioned by the government to do this, not that the United States government would have asked him to censor anything. Who really knows, because that didn't happen. But he funded this thing entirely on his own. And the reason that he ended up going bankrupt is because he couldn't sell these images. And so, there is something to be said for showing the truth. Maybe you go bankrupt, but it's out there, and now we have this, thorough visual record in photographs that Brady put together for us of this significant time in our history. So just a few more anecdotes about Brady here. So he had really bad eyesight, so he didn't physically take most of the pictures that are credited to him. He focused mostly on the conceptualization of his images and would often appear in the photographs taken with the military leaders. So we kind of touched on this last week when we were talking about Erebors and his Daguerrean Excursions publication, how he had commissioned all of these photographers to make these specific photos that he wanted, but he didn't credit any of them. He took full credit as the conceptualizer of the publication. Similar thing was happening with Brady at this time. So the recognition of photographers who worked for other image makers became a lot more common during the Civil War. So a lot of the photographers, including Timothy Sullivan and Alexander Gardner, who worked for Brady, would often be out taking and making the physical images while Brady would conceptualize the content. He would tell them what he wanted, and they would go make the image. So, for example, this image here, Soldiers on the Battlefield from 1862, is an albumen silver print created by Alexander Gardner, but artistic credit is given to Matthew Brady. Now, as we sort of go back through a lot of these historical photographs, we're able to find these clues that allow us to correctly attribute the photograph to both parties. So, while historically this particular image, among many others, would have been credited only to Brady, today if you saw it in a gallery or a museum, you might see it credited to both Brady and Gardner. And that then leads us into talking about Alexander Gardner. So Gardner eventually resigned from Brady's staff and goes off to work on his own. Most of Gardner's images also feature the death and destruction in war. So again, showing those gruesome things that probably aren't going to sell images, but it's going to provide a really solid visual historical record of everything that happened. So in this image here, Gardner reconfigured this scene for the camera so that he could intensify it and make it more effective both visually and emotionally. And this image is called Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter. He actually moved the corpse over to the stone wall and used his own backpack to prop up the soldier's head. And, whatever your feelings are about staging, decide for yourself how you feel about that. I think I take some issue with moving dead bodies for artistic purposes, but Gardner didn't keep his staging a secret. So he would be very open about, like, oh yeah, I moved this body here, I moved these things around to make the picture better. So that indicates that the public was willing to allow the photographer to construct a scene that was true in a larger sense than maintaining visual facts. So there's a video for Gardner too, but let's talk a little bit more about him here, and then we'll watch that in a moment. So here's another one, and the man standing in this image is one of Gardner's assistants. So he's probably trying to see like how to set up this particular scene to make it the most visually effective. And this is kind of a great photograph because you don't often see these kind of behind the scenes ones throughout history. You only see the final version. So something like this, you don't usually see like a documentation of the process here. So that's kind of what this one is. Gardner also shot a series of photographs of the conspirators who plotted the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He photographed several of them after their arrest and published actual images of their execution, which is difficult to look at. And this is one of many. He kind of has a whole series that shows the whole process of them being executed here. And, it's not always comfortable to look at, but between Gardner and Brady, they weren't holding anything back when it came to showing the realities of war, but also this what happens during an execution. So this type of series here that I'm referring to can be considered a precursor to the photo essays that will come much later in publications like Life magazine, National Geographic, things like that. So we're starting to see more and more of these photo series that tell a greater story pop up. So let's watch the Gardner video, and then we'll sort of start to move on to some other things here. So let me just get to our Gardner video. Here we go.
For Matthew Brady, who came to the battlefield starting 2 days after the battle. He spent 4 days here, took about 70 images on plates of glass.
He was the person that had to deal with all the danger and the trials and tribulations of having a horse-drawn photographic lab to cart around the countryside. And he took all of the photos that we now have of the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. Gardner's photos, which of course Matthew Brady got the credit for, were the eye-opening images that brought the reality and the horrors of the battlefield to the non-combatants.
Before this, war was seen through paintings and sketches, and most of them were kind of glorious images of grand charges and flags.
And to see these mangled bodies, and particularly the rows of dead that appear in some of his images, was shocking to the public. Very shocking.
The easiest way to say it, this is the birth of photojournalism. It's the first time that photographs of a battlefield before the dead were buried were seen by anyone.
That's when politicians and others realized the importance of photography. What I find fascinating is that On one particular day after the Battle of Antietam, September 19th, 1862, you had on the same portion of the battlefield, that section called the Sunken Road or the Bloody Lane, two men who were trying to capture images, but doing it in two entirely different ways. You had the artist correspondent of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, Frank Shell, sitting on the hillside doing a from-life sketch, and then not too far away, you had Alexander Gardner with the new technology of photography capturing Confederate dead in the sunken road before they were pulled out and put in the burial trenches. And I just think that's pretty interesting to see that you have the old means of recording to be printed in a newspaper, and you have the new technology of photography both at the same time or same day, same place. Really emotionally had quite an impact.
When that display was put on New York City, they had the exhibition 2 weeks after the battle, The Dead of Antietam. People were lined up down the street to see it. Front page news, New York News. One thing that the Tribune got right was what the impact was to the families and the people that were affected by this battle. People saw what this battle did to their brothers, their fathers, their sons. And the best line of all was how the reporter said that broken hearts cannot be photographed.
All right. So that video is great because it sort of sums up some of the questions that we've been looking at. Hold on here, I clicked on something wrong. All right. All right, hold on, here we go. All right, so let me get us back to our slideshow, but they're talking about the exhibition there at the end when all the photographs came through. So the exhibition drew hundreds and hundreds of people, and that was a question at the beginning that I brought up, right? Like, would people want to see these images? And the answer is yes. They do want to see the reality of war. This is something that had never been put out there before, never seen. You know, you could only really imagine what this was going to look like. And using the paintings, he even touched on that in that video. You know, paintings don't show death in the same way that a photograph does. So this was all, you know, groundbreaking for the time. So before we move on from the Civil War, I do want to talk about something that's kind of I like to say fun, but I think my definition of fun might be different than yours. So let's just call it interesting. So the Civil War estimates the death toll at about 620,000 for both the North and the South. So the whole death count was, you know, just under 700,000 people, which is insane. So you have grieving relatives and friends. They've lost someone and they want to try to contact their dead loved ones. And something that sort of was a huge draw in the Victorian era in the 19th century was spiritualists and folks who could communicate with the dead. There were a lot of, you know, we've talked about different types of entertainment and how that's very different from how we have entertainment today, like the folks going to visit the camera obscuras or having them in their homes, you know, collecting the carte de visite, experiencing 3D with the stereograph. Those are all types of entertainment. And so another type of entertainment would be inviting like a psychic essentially into your home and having a seance. So you'd have all your friends over and you'd have this seance party. And at the time, they didn't consider that to be like just entertainment. They believed in it. So after the Civil War, folks would try to contact the dead through spiritualists, and you have these so-called spirit photographers who would create photographs to kind of show ethereal loved ones or kind of wisps of smoke indicating their presence. here's one. And the most famous one, actually, is this one. This is a best-selling Carte de Visite, and it's a portrait taken by an American spiritualist photographer, William Howard Mumler. It shows Mary Todd Lincoln with the ghost of her assassinated husband, Abraham Lincoln, standing behind her. And so you can see this is how the spirit photographers kind of operated here. And there's a couple different ways to make this happen. Obviously, we don't have Photoshop, so they're not going in toning down the opacity on the layer that has Abraham Lincoln on it. This is a very different way of approaching this through darkroom techniques. And again, those of you who have any sort of analog background or darkroom background, you might have a better hold on how these processes work. But I'll finish talking about this subject and then give you a couple versions of how this can work to make these types of photographs without Photoshop. This style was also, it wasn't just popular in the United States, it was popular in Europe too. And there's this French spiritualist photographer, Edouard Bouget, and he was accused of creating fraudulent images. But he had clearly admitted that he was deceiving his customers by using these double exposures. But some of the clients were completely unconvinced, and they maintained that his photographs totally recorded visits from the other side. So even though some of these spiritualist photographers were totally open about how they made these photographs and that they weren't actually ghosts visiting from the other side, some people just refused to believe it. So here you have, on the left, there's a man standing behind the woman. On the right, we have sort of some smoke going up in front of a child. Here we have sort of faded imagery in the background behind this woman. And then we have this man has likely his lovely bride leaning on his head there. So again, a couple different ways this can be done. The most common way is to do a double exposure. So what you would do is you would take a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln, print it almost to the exposure that you want it on the paper, and then before you put that through the developer, you take another picture, like maybe an older picture of Abraham Lincoln, and you expose that only for a little bit of time on the paper. And that way Mary Todd Lincoln gets a little extra time, so she comes out like fully exposed, but because Abraham Lincoln didn't get enough time, he comes out looking like a ghost. So that's kind of how that works. The other way that you can do it is by stacking negatives. So you can put two negatives together and print them that way. That's likely how this one here was done, with like a little dodging and burning. And then this one on the right here, this looks like it's an original photograph of this woman with her child, and then the photographer has added this smoke effect to indicate that there's some sort of ghosted element in there. So really fascinating, and there's a lot of research out there about this particular type of spiritualist photography. So if you're interested in it, I recommend digging in, because it's pretty fun to explore how these photographers were working with this around this time. Okay, so we're going to move around the globe now and talk about some other conflicts that were happening after the Civil War and get a vibe for kind of the globalism, right? So we started with the Crimean War and the conflicts there and the censorship happening. Then you move to the Civil War and there's no censorship happening there, which is great. And then we want to see how photography is being used in some of these other conflicts around the world. So this is going to be not as in-depth as the Crimean conversation or the Civil War conversation, but in order to get kind of an overview of what else is happening, we're going to touch on each one briefly here. So first we have the War of the Triple Alliance in South America. And so in 1864, you've got 80,000 troops under the direction of Paraguay's leader, Francisco Solano Lopez, and they invade Brazil. And then in 1865, you have Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina forming what's called the Triple Alliance to defeat the Lopez government. And essentially the conflict that's happening here for this war arose over all these disputes about navigation routes and land claims, and the war lasts about 5 years. Just like the American Civil War, they're sending photographers out to the fronts. And one of the first, in our records anyway, one of the first Latin American photographers, Esteban Garcia, he's from Uruguay, he organized all of these photographic efforts. And we don't have a ton of information about Esteban Garcia, but his images were published by a United States-funded studio. They were also sold in sets of 10 and called La Guerra Ilustrada, so the War Illustrated. And the photographs show very similar to what we were seeing in the Civil War photographs, the troop formations, the battle preparations, not that dissimilar from photographs in the Crimean War and the Civil War. Next, we have the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. And the Franco-Prussian War began from this political and economic rivalry between France and Prussia. France declares war in 1870, only to be defeated over and over again. And so there's this provisional government that's created in Paris in the winter of 1870. Well, prior to that, but it was in the winter of 1870 that the Prussian troops laid siege to the city. And this is when I was talking about Nadar earlier in the first half. This is the time when he would go out in his hot air balloon to deliver the mail and take aerial photos of the city. So just so we can connect the dots on our timeline here. There were other passenger balloons, like hot air balloons with names. They had names on them. People would name them Daguerre and Niepce, and they would, outside of just Nadar, other folks too would try to deliver the mail through their hot air balloons and communications that way. They also used carrier pigeons, which is why there's a picture of a pigeon on your screen right now, and they carried hundreds of thousands of messages of photographically reproduced text. So text would be photographed, printed, and rolled up in these tiny tubes, and then each pigeon would have its little backpack, and the tube would go in there, and they would deliver these messages. And then sometimes the images, when they reached their destination, they would be projected onto a wall using a magic lantern so that a large group of folks could read the text kind of all together. And this was like a super brilliant idea, except that the Prussians decided that they didn't like that they were communicating this way. They didn't want them communicating at all. So they let loose a whole slew of falcons, and the falcons went and killed all the pigeons. So that's really depressing. But that's what was happening with the communications there. And those who were supporting the idea of a French Republic, they declared themselves the Paris Commune. So this commune lasted only 3 months until the French government repossessed the city, and around 25,000 Parisians were killed at this time. This image on your screen here is by we don't know who made this. This is an unknown photographer, and it shows the carnage with an image of these numbered corpses. So each corpse in these coffins has a number on them to identify them. And the reason that we talk about this photograph is because depending on which side you are on here, this photograph of the dead communards could be read by their supporters as a symbol of tragedy because they've lost all of these people, or by the enemies as a symbol of victory. So it's important to always kind of consider, both sides of a photograph when you're looking at it from this sort of war perspective, this conflict perspective. During and after the Commune, photography was used to record events as well as to promote and explain and rationalize these political positions. And this image here, for example, the fall of the Vendôme column, the communards posed for photographs both before and after it was torn down. It was actually a statue of Napoleon Bonaparte, and they had declared that it was a symbol of barbarianism and false glory, and I think that that's the truth of it, and we're experiencing some of that similar now in the United States, taking down some of these Confederate statues that were more about force and false glory than anything else. So these photographs were taken by Bruno Braquius, who was a supporter of the communards. He took about 109 views of the commune, and then he had them bound in an album and sold them that way, and it was titled Paris During the Commune. The only problem with this is that these photographs were later used to identify and arrest all the communards when the French government took over again. So poor guy, he all his hard work and documentation of this ended up getting people arrested because he had their likeness photographed. So again, this is something that wouldn't have happened before photography because no one's likeness would have been captured in that way. I really like this print here. I believe it's a lithograph. And the activities of the photographers in Paris after the fall of the Commune were the subject of this. This is like a satirical illustration of what's happening during the Commune, and the center of this image is the photographer, right? So the placement of this photographer in this image and his disregard for the urgent task of the firefighters and the suffering of the woman and child seem to criticize the neutrality and intrusiveness of photography and the public's kind of desire for sensational photographs. And this is the first time that we're kind of seeing this commentary made. It's going to surface more and more as we move forward, but this is like such a truthful rendition of the photographers. They would do anything to get the most sensational image because they get more money if they have a more sensational image, right? So just keep this image in your mind as we move forward and as I kind of bring up some other situations that are quite similar to how this is happening here. So next we're going to travel to India. So now we've gone over a little bit all of these wars. Photography is being used in addition to documenting the conflicts. It's also being used to duplicate maps, descriptions of terrain, and depictions of different armaments much more frequently in combat settings. So not only is it being used to document what's happening within the wars and the conflicts, but within that situation, they're finding ways to make photography useful to them to make everything more efficient. So photographers are increasingly accompanying troops both to record military exploits and to take pictures of foreign countries so that they can bring those back home either as cartes or stereos or for gallery exhibition. So overall here we're going to touch briefly on the photographic infiltration into India, China, and Japan, starting with India here. And so this is a photograph by John Christian Dannenberg. Dannenberg was a German photographer who made this particular photo in northern India of the Maharaja. And it's an interesting image because it was later overpainted by an anonymous artist in a very distinctly Indian style. So this image would have been made completely in black and white and then hand-colored in to the tastes of the specific artist that worked on this one. So a lot of the wealthier folks in India had photos made to kind of mark historic events and as presentation pieces to show like visiting dignitaries at meetings and events. And this is kind of when photography came into India and the photographers had to teach the people in India how to kind of become their own amateur photographers, if you will. And again, I hate that word amateur, but because I think everyone was an amateur, but that word just comes up all the time. So British photographer Samuel Bourne treks out into the Himalayan mountains. And remember that wagon picture we were looking at earlier? Like, can you imagine climbing up into the mountains with all of that equipment? Like, I can't imagine. Like, you got to be dedicated to your craft to do that. but you don't sort of see his struggle represented in any of his images. You have this really like lovely image of the mountains, and so I wouldn't say he's censoring it, because what he's up to here isn't anything to do about his travel experience and more about documenting these mountains. So I would say that he's curating an experience for you here, visual experience. Bourne said that the mountains were not well adapted for pictures, that the character of the Himalayan scenery in general was not very picturesque. So he would very carefully choose his camera angles and scenes in order to depict a more serene landscape. So that is kind of how he's curating that experience for you there. Next, we have Felice Beato, and he's going to pop up throughout our journey throughout these countries. He was a pretty mobile guy, getting around the world. So here, Beato was in India making photos right after the Indian Mutiny, which began in 1857. Which began the 1857 uprising of Indian-born troops in the employ of the British East India Company. So the private corporation that controlled trade in India against the regular British army. And in this image, Beato is photographing the British perspective, which included severe punishment of the rebels, and that's seen here in the execution of mutineers in the Indian Mutiny. Next, we have John Murray. He's another Western photographer who went to India as a medical doctor and ended up taking over 800 images during his time there. He was particularly skilled in making very large format images and panoramas, where he would create them using 2 or 3 connected photographs. So combination printing again. He didn't have the rotating panoramic camera, the swinging lens that we looked at last week. He was using just one camera and kind of moving it along, and you can see how that happens in this photograph here. You have the center being a taller image than the ones on the left and right. This is his panorama of the Taj Mahal. So here you kind of see them in one cohesive image, but here's the image of them all kind of separated. So again, he's using one camera, taking 3 images of the Taj Mahal, and then taking his pieces and putting them back together and kind of touching up the edges to give us one feeling. This is very different vibe than using those panoramic cameras that we looked at last week, but it still works. So now let's go to China. So as I mentioned, we'll see Felice Beato a lot. And so he was with the Anglo-French troops in China in 1860 during the Second Opium War. And around this time, China had kind of been through this decade of civil war and economic instability, sort of amidst this Western pressure to open the country more to commerce. The opium trade, which was super profitable to British, French, Dutch, and Americans, was still running strong. It flourished despite the fact that the Chinese government had totally outlawed it. After the First Opium War, negotiations with European powers in the United States opened some ports to trade, but then you have more conflicts coming up in 1856 when the Chinese officials search this British ship, and in 1860 the Western Allies take over the forts at Taku, which is what we're seeing in this image by Beato here. So what Beato does is he goes in and documents the aftermath of the Allies' efforts to capture these forts. And this particular one here is the interior of one of those strongholds. It kind of shows, you have to look closely to see it, but it shows the unburied Chinese dead inside of this conquered fort. So we're seeing more and more that the censorship we were seeing early on isn't happening as much here. That doesn't mean it's gone. That just means it's we're just looking at some other photographers who don't necessarily believe in that censorship. So there is some evidence to suggest that Beato had corpses dragged into some of these scenes and artfully arranged. So and mostly we think this because when he was in India taking photographs, he would stage a lot of his photographs there as well. So it's likely he's doing the same thing in China, but there's no hard and fast writing about that. So it's just an assumption. There is an American expatriate photographer named Milton Miller, and he sets up his studio practice in Hong Kong. He would sell photographic prints, some of them by Felice Beato, and produce images of upper-class, influential Chinese and foreign citizens, and then sometimes he would take like landscape pictures and stuff too. So he was kind of a jack of all trades. But most of his portraits were of Chinese upper and middle class folks and persons working for foreign traders. So he would always take photographs like the one you see here, where they're sitting facing you directly with just like a hint of expression on their face. But he was always, this one seems to maintain its distance a little more than some of the other photographs we've seen. So that's something to note here. Okay. Like many photographers working in China, John Thompson photographed scenes that kind of dwelled on what seemed unusual and exotic to Western eyes. Also, just to note, most of these people, these photographers we've been talking, not all of them, but most of them that we've been talking about are coming from the West, so either from Europe or the United States, and they're going into these Eastern countries and making photographs. So there's a bit of like tourism happening here, which is problematic, and that will come up again and again as we dig more into this, but I like to acknowledge that that's what's happening here, just so you don't think I'm overlooking it. So some of the images that Thompson would take would be of Chinese folks in a particular costume. He took photographs of their bound feet. He was particularly interested in like punishments that were unique to China. This one here is called the Kangi, and this is a Chinese punishment in which a wooden board was worn around the neck. You can see this gentleman is kind of stuck kneeling with this board here. So that's kind of what Thompson was up to there. I would like to now go to Japan. So the introduction of photography in Japan seems to have come in about the 1840s through these scientific exchanges between the Japanese and this small Dutch trading outpost. And the more rapid growth of commercial photography in Japan began in the 1850s, sort of coinciding with the modernization of the country. So, of course, when Beato arrives in Japan from China, he sees this growing economic opportunity. So this is where he sets up his studio. He starts making these beautiful landscape views. He's representing the sort of tranquility of Japan that he's encountering for the first time there. Beato often, hold on, I'm not on that one yet. He would often photograph Mount Fujiyama, which is the highest and most sacred mountain in Japan, and he was either attempting to highlight its reach through the clouds or the way in which it kind of dominates the surrounding countryside. So contact with the Western photographers was probably one of the main ways in which the Japanese learned photography. In 1872, Uchida Kiuchi made 2 photos of the Emperor Mutsuhito and Empress Haruko, who ruled over Japan as it kind of modernized. And so here we have an original black and white version of the emperor juxtaposed with the hand-colored version, just so you can kind of see the difference between the two. And then we have the empress here. And so when these images were offered for sale, they were super popular, but they had to be withdrawn from the market in 1873 because the government decided that they represented an inappropriate commercialization of the monarchs. So that's kind of funny that they didn't want the photographers to be profiting off of the likeness of the monarchs there. So I'm just going to check my notes here, but I think that kind of tidies up everything I wanted to talk about today. There's obviously a lot more topics in your textbook for you to explore that I didn't touch on, so please feel free to indulge in that. Thank you for hanging in there. I know that this has been a particularly long lecture day, so now that you've watched all of this, maybe take a nap, and I will see you next week.